Hey everyone, welcome to this wonderful fall mushroom tutorial. Today I'm going to be using acrylic. These are going to be the colors that I'm using today, as well as these are the brush shapes I'm going to be using for this painting. Please feel free to use whatever works for you and enjoy following along. Let's get started. The first step in our painting process is to go ahead and tone our canvas. So I've decided to use my large square brush, and on my palette I've mixed burnt sienna and a lot of water together to create a very translucent, very light layer of this burnt sienna. It's going to feel very similar to a watercolor type consistency, and I'm going to apply this all over the surface of my canvas. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, if you've never toned your canvas before, what exactly is the purpose? Now, for me personally, I find that it allows me to see my color mixing much easier, so the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights, and it also is a lot easier on the eyes. So you're going to avoid working on this very white, stark canvas and have something a little softer to work on, allowing us to see things more clearly. Alright, so the next step in our painting process is we can go ahead and start to work on the background of our mushroom painting. Now to start off, I'm using my big square brush, and I've mixed two color combinations of green on my palette. Now this green that I'm working with right now is a mixture of phthalo blue, cadmium yellow, and just a touch of burnt umber together. And I've mixed a slightly darker variant of green, which is going to have a little bit more burnt umber and just a touch of Mars black added to it. Now I'm going to take these two green colors and I'm going to mix them simultaneously on my canvas while the paints are still wet to create a very subtle blur-like effect for this background. You'll see in the reference here that there is a lot going on. There's a lot of blurring, there's a lot of bokeh effects or lens flares, so we're going to get to all of this. But for our first layer, I just want you to focus on diving into those two different greens and adding them all throughout your canvas wherever you see fit. This layer does not have to be perfect. This layer, in all honesty, is probably going to end up 90% covered, so don't worry if you do see some of your burnt sienna coming through those paints, or maybe there's areas that are a little bit thinner than others. Don't get caught up in making this perfect. I'd rather you focus on bouncing between this light and dark green and having fun getting your brush strokes in the paint and on the canvas than worrying about it being absolutely perfect. First and foremost, I did want to apologize. For whatever reason, this segment in the tutorial, my camera did not want to stay focused, and I did not realize this until after I was already done painting and I was starting to work on editing, and I went, oh, it's blurry. This footage is terrible. So I'm so sorry. I did not want to have any large gaps or skips in this process, in this tutorial. So I opted to leave the blurry footage in. I'm so sorry. And I hope that this segment, you find it somewhat helpful. And I'm going to help you more verbally than visually. So just buckle on in and hopefully I can, do this justice. So once your green initial base layer has dried, what we're going to do now is we're going to work from back to front, dark to light. So my first order of business is to get all of these dark shadows in my background blocked in. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to take my original dark green color that I used in step 1, and I'm going to add even more Mars black to it. And when it does go into focus, like right about now, you can see where I'm blocking in these darker values. That is really going to add into the effect of this blurry background. Now, something to keep in mind as well, you do not have to use the square brush like I am doing here. If you find those brush strokes are a little too blunt for your style, you can opt in for a brush like a blender or even like an old round brush that you have that may be a little tattered, might make some really soft, smooth edges for you that may work better for your style. So just keep that in mind. The next step in our painting process is to go ahead and add in the highlights to our background. Now I am adding in these highlights just as my shadows are drying. They're not completely dry quite yet, and this is going to allow my highlights to mix with my shadows and create a brand new blended color directly onto my canvas. And this is really going to affect and create that really blurry bokeh look that I'm going for our backdrop. If I were to add in this highlight directly onto my canvas when it is dry, it's essentially just going to cover over everything and not have that sort of oil-like blend that I'm looking for. Now, with this green, I've taken my mid-tone green from my original base layer, and I've added in cadmium yellow and titanium white to lighten this highlight to my highlight of choice. So you can add as much or as little as you'd like, depending on how bright you want your background to be. Now, something about highlighting that I still have to keep in mind is that sometimes less is more. At this stage in the painting, you may start to see your painting pop off the canvas and really start to come to life. And although this is a great thing, it's very easy, myself included, to get really carried away with our highlights that we end up covering over all of our hard work and the layering that we've done so far. So you can see here as I'm painting, I'm being very selective of where I add in this highlight and how much I'm adding in. I'm being very careful to avoid those really dark areas of shadow, and I'm also making sure that I do let some of that middle tone green shine through as well. So a rule of thumb for me when I am painting is I always want to make sure that areas of shadow, areas of midtone, and areas of highlight can be seen, and that they're kind of nicely balanced. There's not too much of one or the other, unless of course the reference is really quite bright, then that's a whole different story. But if you've got a nicely well lit photo, most times you're going to have those three stages all throughout your painting. Alright, so once that layer has completely dried, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my medium-sized filbert brush and I'm going to take that highlight color and I'm going to add in just a little bit of titanium white to my mixture. And I'm going to, as you can see here, lighten this color up to be the brightest highlight on my background. Now, I've opted to use my medium-sized filbert brush as I find that the filberts for this stage in particular allow me to create a sort of tighter, cleaner brushstroke than my large square would allow. Because the canvas that I'm working on is quite small, a large brush is great for blocking in big areas of color, doing large washes, or kind of just blending and buffing out an area. But now as we're working in these layers, I'm slowly starting to bring this background into focus, and I need a smaller brush that's going to allow me to do that. So I encourage you to practice, play around with what works for you, and that could be a round brush or a blender, so don't feel as though you have to follow this exactly as I'm doing here. So the next step in our painting, once those highlights have dried, we can go ahead now and start to add in what I think is the most exciting aspect of the painting, and that is going to be the bokeh effect in the background. Now, for anyone who may not be familiar with what is a bokeh effect, it is a technique or an effect in photography, so you could see these throughout many different references that you collect for your paintings. And essentially, it's a very blurry background caused by the camera, and usually it will have a very sort of beautiful play of light in the background as well. So I call them floating orbs. I'm sure that is not technical whatsoever, but for the sake of today's painting, we're going to call them floating orbs. And this is just areas, pockets of light dancing in the background of our photograph, and we're going to try to replicate that in our painting. Now, this is still a technique that I am learning myself as an artist. I am still practicing, so we're going to learn this together, and hopefully the tips and tricks that I've learned to achieve this will help you in your art journey. Now, enough blabbing, let's get started. So to start off, I've began with my filbert brush, and I've used my highlight color and I've added in a little more titanium white to this mixture so that it's just a step lighter than our highlight we just completed. I don't want these to stand out too much quite yet. I want there to be a very subtle increase in the lightness. So I've painted a few of these orbs in the background with my filbert brush, but I did want to take a moment and talk about my secret weapon for this effect, and that is a simple, common household Q-tip. I found that my brushes were quite large, and even the smallest round brush, I just created horrible looking circles. They were really bad, and they ended up getting really quite large, me constantly trying to smooth out their edges. They just got bigger and bigger. So I decided that I needed something a little bit more accurate and something that would give me that shape of the bokeh orb with way less effort. And I landed on Q-tips. Now, how I'm going about using these Q-tips is exactly the same way that I would use a regular paintbrush. Nothing really changes aside from the fact that the Q-tips are, in my opinion, a lot more absorbent, and we may need more water and more paint to ensure we get the opacity we're looking for. So I'm going to take this Q-tip and I'm going to dive into the highlight green that I've been using so far, and I'm going to apply it to my canvas in a circular motion. Now I'm going to use this circular motion to determine the size of the bokeh effect, but also the opacity. With acrylic, the more water that you add to your brush, or in this case our Q-tip, the thinner the paint is going to appear. The less amount of water you have, the more opaque the paint will be. So for this bokeh effect, you're going to want to have both. You're going to want to have some orbs that are really quite translucent and thin, so a lot of water on your Q-tip, and those are going to be the lightest orbs, the thinnest orbs, and usually the ones that are furthest away. And then you are going to want to have some that are a little bit more up close in the foreground with less water, and those are going to be more opaque and visible. So I do encourage you to play around with this. You do not need to follow my example exactly. I really just encourage you to have fun, practice these skills, and kind of build the effect how you would build it and the way you want it to look. Now, excuse my head here, you can see that I'm getting quite into this painting, and sometimes I forget my camera is even there. So I apologize if it's in any way distracting or in your way. But I did want to mention something as well, is a subtle color shift. So we've been using the same highlight green for the entire highlights of the painting, but what I'd like to do now is I'd like you to add in more cadmium yellow to your highlight color, and I want you to make a more lemon lime green and add in some spots in that color. You'll notice with the bokeh effect and references that these orbs are not always going to be the same. As I mentioned, their opacity will change, so how dark or how light they will be in terms of their thickness, but they're also going to change in color. So you may have some orbs that are blue-green, you might have some that are really quite yellow, yellow-green, shoot, even some may have a tinge of orange as well, depending on the brightness of the sun in the photograph. So I really want you to kind of let loose. This was a great way for me to experiment with paint, really push myself and the boundaries of my art and my style. So I encourage you to do the same. So once those bokeh effects have dried, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my large mop watercolor brush, I'm going to load those brush bristles full of water, and I'm going to mix in cadmium yellow to create a soft yellow glaze. Now, the purpose behind this glaze is to really blend in this background and soften any harsh edges. So sometimes our brushes or even the Q-tip might have really defined ridges on the outside of our brushstroke, and I find that these soft glazes help to soften our background and kind of create a subtle haze over top of our painting. Now, a glaze can also work with color as well in terms of shifting the color of your paints. I found that my background was a little too minty green for me. I didn't realize that I wasn't adding in enough yellow. So an easy fix to this would be to add this yellow glaze and to change my minty green background to a more lime green background. And this you can do as much or as little as you prefer. Your background may look different from mine, and that's totally okay. So you can either omit this step or try it if you wish and let me know what you think. But I've started to do this more and more with my sort of current paintings, and I've really been happy with the effect that it gives, and it kind of makes my paintings feel and look more realistic. So once that background has completely dried, I can go ahead now and start to work on the sketch on my canvas. Now, because I've already painted this background and it is a little bit on the darker side, a normal graphite pencil probably won't be very visible, so I've decided to opt for my Molotow black liner pen, and I'm just going to go ahead and slowly start to block the outline of my tree stump or my tree limb and my mushrooms. Now, you can do this in many different ways. You can have your sketch down onto your canvas first and then work the background around it. Or if you followed along exactly as I've done, you can go ahead and use a marker, a pen. If you're not comfortable with a more permanent medium and you're one who likes to work in pencil, you can work with a really dark lead like a B, or you can even go ahead and block in with some charcoal, whatever works for you and is in your comfort zone for this stage in the painting. Now you can see here that I'm not being too perfect with this sketch. I'm just blocking in the major aspects of it. So for example, the tree limb, I'm blocking in the areas of moss or foliage, and then I'm coming in over top where the mushrooms will be and just blocking in their outline. This sketch is not permanent. I can go ahead and, the wonderful thing about acrylic, I can go in and actually cover over my sketch entirely, change the shape, the length, whatever you prefer. You can always go in over top with your acrylic paint and adjust it from there. Once you're happy with your sketch, we can go ahead now and start to work on our preliminary base layers of our tree limb, our moss, and our mushrooms. Now, something to keep in mind with acrylic is that some colors are more translucent than others, for example, burnt sienna or cadmium yellow, and with a dark background, they are not going to be able to be directly applied to our canvas. You're going to want to have a base first. Now, you can do your base in titanium white and just do an entire white base. What I like to do is I like to make pastel colors of the final colors I'm going to use for the painting and do that first. So hopefully that makes sense, and I'll show you what I mean. For example, the areas of moss that I'm painting in right now, and the camera can be deceiving sometimes, this color I've used and I've created is titanium white, cadmium yellow, and phthalo blue together to create a very pastel light green. Now, the reason why I've chosen to work in the pastels is because a lot of times I get really confused with my references and my sketches, and if I were to cover over everything in titanium white, I would lose that sketch. I would lose the anatomy of my subject or the overall look and feel, and I would basically have to then re-sketch it with paint or even do a new sketch on top of it, and I just like to keep everything kind of color-coded, like a paint by number. So my moss is light green, my tree is light brown, my mushrooms are light pink, so I kind of keep it color-coded so that I can keep track of my sketch and my underpainting. Now you can see while I've been chit-chatting here that I've slowly started to add in the pastel brown to my tree limb. Now this color is just burnt sienna and titanium white together, and it kind of reminds me of a very light milky coffee color, and I'm just going to go ahead and apply that to all of the areas that I can see of my tree limb. Now, it's totally fine if these colors blend together or if they're, directly touching the brown and the green. It does not have to be perfect. So keep that in mind. This stage in the painting, you are purely working in getting those base layers down and not necessarily worrying about any sort of detail. That for me is something that I am still working on as an artist, is I tend to get too finicky too quickly, and I am worrying about details that are 10 steps ahead of where I am now, rather than building those foundational blocks. So if I can give you any piece of advice for this stage, it's to just purely focus on the anatomy of the subject, and this can apply to landscapes, it can apply to florals, it can apply to animals. Get those base layers down first and then worry about all these sort of fun, finicky details later on. And as a side note, I am still using the same small square brush. I've done the entire base layer using this brush. Now that the tree limb and the foliage has been blocked in, I can go ahead now and start to work on the base layers of our little mushrooms. Now, again, I'm using the same square brush and I've mixed a color combination of cadmium red, a touch of cadmium yellow, and then I've used titanium white to create this really soft coral salmon color. And I decided to start with this very light pink as this mushroom has a lot of white, pink, and purple in it. And I just thought because the vast majority of the mushroom was pink, this would be a really great color to start with and add the other colors in over top. Now, depending on the color that you would like your mushrooms to be, because this is kind of a fun fantasy foresty painting, it doesn't have to be like real life. You could choose to do a blue, a purple, a yellow even, whatever color you prefer. Just remember to make it pastel. So you can make the color on your palette and then add in titanium white to it to create your very first base layer. Once those layers have dried, we can go ahead now and start to do what I think is the fun part, and that's adding in that pop of color to our painting. Now, I'm going to start off with the tree limb, and I've mixed a color combination of burnt sienna and just a touch of cadmium yellow together, and this is going to be the main base for our tree limb. This tree limb is really on the sort of warm red side, and so burnt sienna was a perfect color for me to use. However, if you want your tree limb to be a little bit on the cooler, darker side, you could opt for something like a burnt umber. Whatever brown color you have available, we're going to go ahead and apply that to our tree limb right now. Now with these translucent colors, although we have a fantastic base to work on, you will notice in some areas of this painting, especially with burnt sienna, there are still some areas that are a little translucent or a little streaky, and this is perfectly normal. You will, in theory, have to do maybe 1, 2, or 3 layers depending on the type of paint that you're using, the brand, and the color. So with whatever color you've chosen for this tree limb or even the moss, if you do find that it is a little streaky even with the base, you will want to just come in with another layer on top and sort of solidify the opacity that you're looking for and make sure that it's evenly covered. Once your tree limb has dried, we're going to do the exact same thing now with our foliage with our bright green color. Now I've mixed a green of phthalo blue, cadmium yellow, and a touch of titanium white together, and I'm going to use my small square brush, which for this painting seems to be my favorite. Looking back at this footage, I just defaulted to the square brush, but you can use whatever you prefer, and I'm going to block that in all over the areas of pastel green we blocked in previous. Now the same thing applies with our green as the burnt sienna. If you feel as though it's not applying as nicely as you'd like, or it's a little streaky in some areas, you can go ahead and add in 1, 2, 3 layers of this green until you get the opacity that you're looking for. Something to keep in mind as well is don't be afraid to go beyond your sketch, if you will. So if some of this moss, extrudes some of its area and onto your tree limb or out onto the background, that is totally okay as well. It does not have to be perfect, and in fact this moss and this foliage gets a little kind of crazy anyway, so it's okay to have some pieces sticking out here or there. For me, it kind of just enhances the realism. So speaking of crazy moss, we're actually going to do that right now. So I'm going to take my small square brush, and I actually dunked back into my pastel green, and I'm going to go ahead and add in the areas of moss or foliage that extend out beyond our tree limb. So in this reference, there is a really beautiful area of moss that actually falls down off the end of the tree branch, and then the area of moss kind of that's grassy on the top. So I'm just going to go ahead and go around the entire painting, blogging in with this really beautiful pastel green, the areas of foliage that are extending out from my tree limb. You can add as little or as much as you'd like. This is entirely up to you, and I just say have fun with it. Alright, so once those layers have completely dried, we can go ahead now and start to work on the shadows of our painting. Now, I've decided to work on my tree branch first, as this is going to be the furthest away element aside from the background in our painting. Everything else is going to be layered on top of it, so I want to do the furthest away layers first. I've decided to use my small filbert brush, and I've mixed a color combination of burnt sienna, burnt umber, and a touch of Mars black together, and I've watered this paint down just a little bit with a tiny bit of water. From there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to block in all of the dark areas of this tree bark that I can see. I like to have a little bit more of a painterly style when it comes to my trees. If you've seen any of my paintings before, you'll know that they're not as super realistic as some of my other work. I just like to be a little whimsical and kind of fun with it. So I always say paint however you like, whether you want it to be hyper realistic or a little more on the painterly side is entirely up to you. What I find works for me for painting trees as well is to really have no set plan at all and just see where your paintbrush takes you. You can see as I'm painting here, my brush kind of hovers over my canvas for a moment. I'll drop it down onto my canvas, painting thick lines, thin lines, adding wiggly lines. I'm kind of just all over the place and just having fun with it. Sometimes we try too hard to be too perfect and too much like our reference that we forget that we're painting. We're supposed to be having fun, building a style, and creating something that we're proud of. So I want to encourage you to just go for it, try your best, and just do what feels right for you. Once those elements have dried, we can go ahead now and start to work on the dark shadows of our foliage. So I'm going to use a small filbert brush, and I've mixed a color combination of phthalo blue, cadmium yellow, and a touch of Mars black together. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in all the darkest areas I can see. Now, keep in mind we are working from back to front, dark to light. So I like to get all of my dark shadow elements down onto my canvas first, and then as I work through those layers, I'm going to move towards the foreground, so the closest part of the painting to us, and I'm going to get lighter as I go. And this is just something that has worked well for me. It is something that was easy to remember, and so I hope that hearing this today in today's tutorial, it's helpful for you in your art journey. Now, with the filbert brush, I do find this to be very helpful for painting foliage and for painting fur. Those are the two main reasons why I choose the filbert for my paintings. I find that it gives you a really beautiful brush stroke. It has so many different capabilities, so you can have a very thick stroke using the entirety of the brush, or you can get a really fine, thin brush stroke with the tip of the brush. So it's a very versatile one that I just absolutely adore. And it wasn't actually one that came in one of my very first starter kits. So I hadn't heard of what a filbert brush was actually until I started working with Grumbacher. So if you have not used a filbert brush yet and you'd like to try one, I definitely encourage you to. It was an absolute game changer for me. Speaking of Grumbacher, if you ever want to follow along with my tutorials using the exact same supplies that I'm using, I have some pretty exciting news for you and hopefully you will find it helpful. I am officially an affiliate of the Chartpak store with my very own coupon code. So if you'd like to check it out, all of the links are in the description box below of my individual products that I use in my tutorials, but also the Chartpak store in general. If you use the coupon code Cassandra at checkout, you can save 15% on an order of $20 or more. They have an incredible array of products available, and you can get a lot of goodies on Chartpak's direct store. So please feel free to check it out. Don't forget the coupon code. And once again, thank you so much for your support, both to you, my lovely cozy YouTube community, and Chartpak as well. Thank you so much. And just keep that in mind if you're wanting to follow directly along to these videos. So while I've been chit-chatting here, we're going to slowly start to add in a lighter shade of brown to our tree limb. Now I've decided to use a small or medium-sized round brush. Depending on your canvas size, that brush size may change. It might be a little bigger, a little smaller. And I've mixed a color combination of burnt sienna, cadmium yellow, and a little bit of titanium white together to create this very sort of soft coppery color. And what I'm going to do is in between the areas of shadow that I already painted and our base layer, I'm going to add in these lighter areas of, I'm going to call it tree bark. I'm going to add in areas of tree bark in the lighter areas in my reference. And this, once again, is not something that I really plan out beforehand. I'm following the lightness on my reference photograph, but I'm not necessarily following each individual piece of bark. I'm just having fun with it, seeing where my brush takes me, and really creating this sort of whimsical, very fantasy looking type wood. Now, something to keep in mind as well, depending on how much foliage you've added to your tree limb, will affect the amount of middle tone and highlight, so the lightness the tree branch will receive. If you have more foliage, typically your tree branch is going to be more covered, more dense, which is going to make the tree branch darker. Now you see here on mine, I have a few large chunks that I've kept open, and I know that the light source is going to be able to bounce off of this wood, making it lighter. So if you are kind of making this painting your own, you're having a little fun and you're experimenting, if you've made it really dense, mossy foliage, you're going to keep that tree branch typically darker, as it's going to be not as lit and probably more damp. And if you've got really large exposed areas, you're going to want to keep them a little bit lighter, allowing that light source to bounce off, and that's the look that you're going to go for. All right, so the next step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an even lighter highlight to certain areas of this tree bark. Now I'm taking a small round brush, and I've taken that original copper color that I was just working in, and I've added in even more titanium white to this mixture, and I'm going to add it very, very sparingly around this tree bark in the lightest areas I can find. So a lot of times for my style, I like to have a very subtle outline to a lot of my subjects. So you're going to see that I have some sort of rim lighting around this tree branch, kind of down towards the bottom and on the top. I don't know why, I just really like the way that it looks, and I feel like it just makes it really pop off this background and kind of stand out. So you can be as sparing or as wild as you want with these outlines or these highlights. I say do what works best for you and what you like the look of, but that's just what I'm going ahead and doing a little bit more of before I start to work on the foliage, just making sure I have the wood of the tree branch looking exactly how I want it. The next step in our painting is to go ahead and work on the mossy area by adding in an even lighter green and much more detail. I've decided to use a small round brush for this section, as I feel as though this brush gives me the most control and allows me to really add in a lot of these beautiful leaves and sort of individual elements to this clump of moss. Now I have mixed a color combination of phthalo blue, cadmium yellow, and a lot of titanium white. It's going to be very similar to our pastel green, just with a little bit more color saturation to it. And I'm going to go ahead and add this all throughout this moss in these little tiny paint flicks. Now, while I'm painting this, I'm thinking about the overall shape of this moss and not necessarily each individual leaf. I used to get very stressed out when painting landscapes in botanicals. I would really try to get every single leaf, every thorn, every petal perfect, and it would actually end up stressing me out and make painting not enjoyable. So every single painting afterwards, I've really made a conscious effort to focus on the shape and the overall look of something rather than each individual detail being perfectly in place. So yes, although I'm painting very small, little tiny leaves, all different directions, I'm not really looking at my reference at all. I'm just kind of going with the overall vibe that I'm feeling and the shape. So I'm doing these large clumps of leaves, then some individual, some are extending beyond that sort of clump of moss outwards onto my tree trunk, which I think is super important, by the way. Overlap and layering with acrylic is crucial. You want your painting to feel seamless, that all of these sort of sections that we've painted so far are cohesive. If all of my moss was perfectly in my little green section and all of my tree trunk was perfectly in the brown section, it's going to look like a puzzle, which could totally be a style you're going for, and that's totally fine. But if you're looking for a style of a more realistic painting, you want to make sure that all of those elements fit together and that they look as though they were painted all at the same time, even if they weren't. So just keep that in mind. I know I got on a quick rant here while we're talking about moss, but I do think it is very important to have that overlap in your painting and the cohesion. I have been talking for quite a while throughout this entire tutorial, and I have in the comments been told that it would be helpful at some stages just to allow the painting to unfold with some nice, soft, relaxing music and allow my visual learners to have a moment and enjoy rather than constantly hearing me blab in their ear. So I'm going to take these next couple minutes while I'm painting this mossy area to just allow you to enjoy, follow along, and then I will catch up with you when we begin the mushrooms. Also, just in case you forget, this next couple sections, I'm going to be using my round brush. I'm going to introduce a liner brush in some areas as well, and I'm using the exact same color, phthalo blue, cadmium yellow, and titanium white together, and that's going to be the next couple minutes. Enjoy. All right, I am back. I hope you enjoyed watching that little segment of our tree branch coming to life. And now that that has been completed, we can go ahead now and start to work on the last part of our painting, and that is going to be these cute little mushrooms. Now, my base layer was a very light pink pastel color, and what I'm going to do before I work on any shadows, highlights, or details is I'm going to solidify the size and the shape of these mushrooms with another layer. I am using my small or medium round brush, and I'm mixing a color combination of cadmium red, titanium white, and in some areas just a little bit of cadmium yellow. And I'm going to go over the entire base layer of these mushrooms and just make sure that they're the sort of look and shape and size that I'm going for. I'm also going to fix, as you can see here, any sort of very strange lines. If there's any sort of indents or wiggliness, I'm just making sure they're nice and smooth and prepared for the next stage in our painting. So the next step, once those mushroom layers have dried, is I'm going to go ahead and add in a shadow to the stem of our mushrooms. Now I am using a very small round brush, and I've mixed a color combination of titanium white, cadmium red, and a little bit of Mars black together to create this very dusty rose type color that is just slightly darker than my stem. And I'm going to add that in to the areas of shadow on these mushrooms that I can see. Now, I started with the stems first as I wanted to make sure that this color was what I was looking for, and I was a little bit nervous and intimidated. I've never painted mushrooms before, and so I thought, let's start with the easiest part and the smallest part, and then we'll work our way up. So if you are a mushroom painting expert, you can dive right into the good stuff, or if you're like me and a little apprehensive, we're just going to start here. Now, typically these shadows on the mushroom are going to be seen just under the cap, so the large wide brim part, and then they're also going to have some shadow down on the bottom of the stem by our foliage. Now, after you paint in this shadow, and this is all sort of artist dependent, if you want to add in some foliage back over top of that stem, you're going to do it after it dries. So again, keeping in mind your layering, some of this foliage might be covering some of that stem, and you're going to want to add that in after on top. So just keep that in mind. All right, so this next step in the painting is to go ahead and paint the tops of our mushroom. Now, admittedly, I kind of completed the left side mushroom first entirely before I worked on the rest because I wanted to make sure that I had the system down right and I got the look and feel that I was going for. So to start off, I'm using my small round brush and I'm using that same exact shadow color I used for the stem, and I'm going in and I'm blocking in some of that shadow on the, I'll call it the cap of the mushroom. And again, I am not scientific whatsoever, so I'm only calling these things that I know or that I've kind of made up for myself as a reminder. So if it's not 100% accurate, just keep that in mind. I'm an artist, not a scientist, so just bear with me. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use that dark shadow color on the cap of the mushroom. And then I'm also going to come in with a purple. So these mushrooms are a purple pink sort of blend, starting from purple at the top, working their way down to pink, and then a light pink on the bottom. So to make this purple color, I've used cadmium red, I've used phthalo blue together, and I've added in just a touch of titanium white. And then for the pink, I'm using cadmium red and titanium white together. So between those two colors, I'm kind of going back and forth, wet on wet blending directly on my canvas to get the gradient that I'm looking for. Now, if you're not a fan of the wet on wet blending directly onto your canvas, what you can also use is a glaze to get the purple onto your pink. So what I would do is I would have the entire pink layer dry and completed. I would mix my purple color and water it down to a glaze, and then I would slowly start to layer and apply the purple top down on my mushroom. And that's another way of going about it. Same with working the white up. You could also glaze the white up towards the top of the mushroom, or wet on wet blend as I've done here as well. So as long as you remember that for this exact reference and the color combination, it's purple, pink, and sort of a light pink white color down towards the bottom. However you want to go about creating that on the mushroom is entirely up to you. So once I had a better understanding of the mushroom painting process, I felt confident to start working on the middle mushrooms now and completing those. So I'm once again using my small round brush, and I've kept the colors of our kind of rose pink and our baby pink on my palette, and I'm going to use those to fill in the details of this mushroom. Now with these center ones, I did notice that they were more on the pink side and lighter side and much smaller. So these ones do not quite have that purple top yet. So it's just going to be those two shades of pink blended together on your canvas to create a nice soft gradient. All right, so I'm going to do the exact same steps now for the furthest right mushrooms, including the little one down towards that tree branch. That one doesn't get a lot of color. It is tucked a little bit behind, so I just added in a touch of that baby pink along the bottom and kept the top a little darker, thinking that it might be kind of shadowed from the mushroom over top. Now on that far right one, it seems to be the largest, fullest mushroom. So I am doing a really wide brim down towards the bottom with my soft baby pink and my very small round brush. And then I'm going to go in over top and I'm going to add in that dark purple, which if you recall was made with cadmium red, phthalo blue, and titanium white together. And I'm going to go ahead and add that in, and look at that beautiful purple really against that nice pink. It is such a beautiful combination of colors, and I honestly want to paint some more. I've really been enjoying this. I hope you have too. And just seeing this come together now, even during the voiceover, it really is a beautiful gradient. Now, something to keep in mind with your gradients as well is if you find that the wet on wet blending is not working for you, you can always go in with, and I did in some sections for this larger mushroom, adding in a cadmium red with much less white underneath that purple. So it's kind of like purple, then a kind of like a dusty rose, sort of darker red, meets the pink, and then the white. So you can always add in an extra step to your gradient in the middle. If you find that the purple to our pink is just too much of a gap, you can always add in that darker color to sort of blend it out more seamlessly. Something that I like to add to my paintings, especially the ones that are a little more fantasy, a little more painterly, is my Molotow acrylic pump marker in white. Now, this is a very, very opaque white marker, and something that I normally use for whiskers in my animal portraits, whether they're pets or wildlife. That's typically the use that I have for it. Same with catch lights in the eyes, things like that. Now, I could have used just regular titanium white paint on the bottom of these mushrooms, but something was calling me towards this marker to really get a beautiful stark white outline and almost make the mushrooms look as if they're glowing. That was my sort of thought process and kind of the look and feel that I was going for. So I decided to bring in this marker to really punch these highlights. I've used this marker now down towards the bottom of the mushrooms, but you can see here that I'm also adding a little bit of a glow at the bottom of my tree branch. And now I'm also going to add in what I'm going to call fairy dust around these mushrooms and this tree branch. It could be snow, it could be fireflies, whatever you want to add to this painting. I'm just going ahead and dotting this marker around my painting, not too much. I mean, I don't want it to be super overwhelming, but just enough that it's noticeable to my viewer and adds a little bit of spice to my painting. In addition to the fairy dust and the highlights, we can also use this Molotow marker for signing our artwork as well. So don't forget to add your signature, and we're pretty much finished with this painting. I'll show you in a second an overall view. All right, and there you have it. There is our finished forest mushroom painting. I so hope you enjoyed painting along with me today. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and a comment. I am always going back and checking on all of my videos to see your feedback, whether you liked the subject matter, the style of the video. So if you did, please let me know. I am forever grateful for your response. Now, a big shout out to our Patreon members. Thank you so much for your support as always. If you too would like to join our Patreon, all the information can be found in the description box below. Thank you as always to our sponsors, Charpak, Grumbacher, and Molotow. And don't forget to use your coupon code Cassandra to save 15% on an order of $20 or more. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like another tutorial, be sure to check out these next videos.